All right, we will go ahead and get started today. Welcome back, everyone, for our second Willingness to Engage webinar in our Alda Kavli Learning Center's Willingness to Engage series. Regardless if this is your first webinar with us or not, we appreciate you being here today to unpack the brand of science with Dr. Chris Volpe and Dr. Todd Newman. And on behalf of the Alda Kavli Learning Center, I would like to thank the Rita Allen Foundation and Kavli Foundation for supporting this work and webinar series. My name is Claire Hozowski. I am the Science Communication Specialist at the Allen Alda Center for Communicating Science. And in case you are less familiar with us, the work that we do at the Alda Center is about empowering scientists, medical professionals, and researchers to communicate their work clearly and vividly to all audiences. Before we begin, I have a few logistics to go over. As you can see, we are using the webinar format in Zoom. And as the conversation today unfolds, please put your questions for the panelists using in the Q&A box. And then towards the end of our time together, we will hold some time for a Q&A session. If you are having any technical troubles, please reach out to me or my colleague, Nicole Levy, who is an assistant professor of practice at the Alda Center and joining us today to assist you if we have any technical troubles. And then finally, we are recording today's session and a copy will be available for viewing on our website, aldacenter.org afterward. A single word can trigger an immediate torrent of thoughts and emotions. During this webinar, our panelists will review recent data on what the public thinks and more importantly, feels when they hear the word science, and how their reactions differ from those of scientists. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Christopher Volpe, who is the Executive Director and founding board member of Science Counts. With an academic background in physical chemistry and 2 decades of the private sector experience in marketing and branding, Dr. Volpe is a leading voice in developing data-driven social marketing strategies to foster connections between the scientific community and general public. As well, we'll hear from Dr. Todd Newman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is an affiliate of the Holt Center for Science and Technology Studies and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Newman's research focuses on the role of strategic communication within the context of science, technology, and the environment. This includes his most recent work examining the role of communication training in supporting scientists' communication and engagement goals, including developing innovative methods for evaluation, as well as integrating frameworks for marketing and branding within the science of science communication. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Claire. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Chris Volpe. I am the Executive Director of Science Counts, and Science Counts is a nonprofit that was formed to boost awareness and public support for science. So understanding the role that science plays in people's lives and understanding, just what the word science and the concept of science means to ordinary mainstream Americans is an integral part of what we do. And we've been studying it for about 5 years, and we're at the point where we're ready to launch what we hope will be an innovative, novel social movement for science. So we're excited about that, but that's a story for another day. I wanted to share, some of our findings, and Todd Newman and I have been frequent collaborators. And so I'm going to start us off, but then he's going to take us to an even more interesting place in defining, what appears to be a fundamental chasm between the scientific community and mainstream America when it comes to some basic perceptions about science. So let me go ahead and share some of our findings here. So as Claire said, I'm actually a trained natural scientist. My background's actually in climate change, but for various reasons, I have been doing marketing, entrepreneurial marketing for about 20 years. So I'm this strange, unholy alliance between science and marketing. And I don't know about many of the people on the call, but marketing and sales and branding, these were words that I intentionally became a scientist to avoid. But actually, the realm of marketing, we could learn a lot from marketing, commerce marketing, when it comes to science communication. Okay. I would bring to everyone's attention an interesting article that serendipitously appeared 2 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal by Neil deGrasse Tyson, where Neil says science needs better marketing. And so if you haven't seen that, take a look at it. It's a very interesting article. I particularly found the graphic that accompanied the article very interesting, and you see it here because this graphic represents two of the fundamental mistakes that we as scientists make when we try to market science. You see that, marketing is putting sciencey things, DNA, atoms, Erlenmeyer flasks, and a lab coat on a billboard. And so I want to clear up a couple of these misconceptions about what marketing really is. A lot of people think marketing is manipulation and it's sales and it's all this other stuff, and it really isn't. So just some quick language. What is marketing? Marketing is about making a value proposition. In English, that means it answers the question, why should I care? Okay, so marketing is not just advertising or promotion, although that's how most of us think of the word, and that is a small sliver of the universe that is marketing. But marketing is much bigger than that. It's basically painting a picture of some future state that says, wouldn't you love to be here? Or wouldn't you love to have this? Or wouldn't you, feel better if this could be the life you live? So it tends to be forward-looking, and it tends to make an emotional appeal. And that's really important, that emotional part, because that's a part that we as scientists often feel uncomfortable about when we're engaging in science communication. And so the old, based on the old proverb, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Marketing is just leading the horse to water. You don't worry about forcing the horse to drink. You just get it there, okay? Now, in contrast, just to complete the picture, there's this other thing called sales. What is sales? Well, sales and marketing are different things. They involve different sets of goals and different tools. Sales is about closing the deal. It's about removing barriers to action. It's basically convincing the horse to drink. And that's a separate thing, and that's really not what we're going to be talking about here today, okay? So I want to focus on that first part, marketing. Within the universe of marketing, there's this idea of brand. What is a brand? Well, for many of us, when we think of brand, we think of various product lines, okay? So, Gucci, Lexus, McDonald's, we think of specific products. But I want to use the word brand here in a more general, generic sense, okay? And what brand is it's an initial emotional, sensory, and cognitive reflex, and reflex is an important word here, experienced when a person first thinks about an object, person, or idea. So to personify this a little bit, it's in essence the reputation around a word or an idea. So let me give you an example. If I say the word cactus, I can more or less correctly predict that when it comes to color, most of us right now are thinking green. When it comes to texture, most of us are thinking prickly. When it comes to temperature, as you imagine a cactus, it's probably hot outside, it's probably sunny, and it's probably dry. And then if I were to say something truly crazy, like put the word Alaska in front of cactus, all right, that should cause you pause, because we've basically created a brand dissonance. In other words, the word cactus comes with all of these emotional, sensory, and cognitive ideas. It's like a happy little gift pack. That's what brand is. Brand is basically saying when you say a word or you talk about a thing like Donald Trump, there's a flood of emotional and sensory and cognitive ideas, okay? And so why is it important? Because it's in essence the intuitive starting point with any conversation that you have, okay? So now making this real to science, the question that we found ourselves as an organization 5 years ago was, we asked ourselves, what is the brand of science? In other words, when you say science to anybody, what do they think? What do they feel? What senses are triggered? And somewhat shockingly, we as a community did not have data on what the answer to that question is. And so how can you have communication? How can you try to persuade the public with regards to climate change and other issues if you don't understand what emotions and ideas the word science itself is triggering? Because that's the beginning of the journey. So just to drive home this idea of brand a little bit more before we get into what we found, Harley-Davidson is a brand. What does Harley-Davidson sell? A lot of people would say motorcycles. That's not actually correct. What Harley-Davidson's brand sells is freedom with attitude. Okay, that's what Harley-Davidson is about. Another example, Apple. And Apple in the 90s, when Steve Jobs, who was a natural marketer and brander, was building the brand, what is the brand of Apple? Well, it was irreverence with style. And this is a picture of Muhammad Ali, who was a wonderful personification of, in essence, irreverence with style, which is why they had him as a representative here. And so the question here, a really important, simple question, is to Americans, the general public, what is the brand of science? Science is what? And we didn't know until just recently. So we as an organization, with a partnering organization named Research America, launched a survey, a study to try to get to the bottom of this. You know, what emotions does science trigger? What does it mean? And so this is some of the findings. The first thing you do when you're trying to figure out the brand is you ask people what words they associate with that thing, in this case, science. And so we found that the words that were positively associated with science were great words: discovery, curiosity, optimism, youth, which was a little bit of a surprise, invention, innovation. Good words. The words that were negatively associated with science, that people didn't want to hear when it comes to science, were for the most part words that have to do with money, investment, budget, funding. These are terms that are often used in Washington when you talk about funding science, but to the general public, these were big turnoffs. Another interesting one was the past. People didn't like to associate science with looking back. They tend to look at science in terms of looking forward. And a real turnoff for a lot of Americans is the word competition. They don't like the idea of science being a competitive enterprise, especially when it comes to international collaboration. The feeling is that, you know, science is one of these things that humanity should rally around. We shouldn't compete. And that poses an interesting conundrum in, you know, the world we live in, because there are competitive forces with regards to research and development internationally. And so balancing the altruistic nature of science with the reality, frankly, that there is international competition is going to be tricky. And we don't have an answer for that, but that's definitely something that's going to have to be rectified in the next couple of years. In terms of phraseology, how people use the word science, we heard three recurring themes over and over again. Science is a means to an end. Okay, it's a utility, it's a tool. Science, again, tends to be altruistic. It serves the greater good. And then the third theme is science is a path to a better tomorrow. Again, capturing that looking forward optimism. And so we took these two sets of data and lots of others, and we came to a conclusion that the brand of science is hope. Another way of saying that is, for most Americans, the words science and hope are interchangeable. They're virtually synonyms. Okay. That was a bit of a surprise. And so as scientists, we think, confirmation is really important. And so in subsequent surveys by us and others, we developed this just very simple question to qualitatively verify whether, in fact, hope is the right word here. So this is the question: which of the following best describes what you feel? And again, we're focusing on emotion when you hear the word science. And you see the choices below. And on several of these surveys, the other option was one that you could then write in your own phrase. And a lot of people did. In particular, scientists like to write in their own phrase. This is what we found over the years. In 2017, when we conducted a campaign that focused on just the top third of Americans when it comes to Americans who support science, 2/3 of Americans use the word hope. Everything else was a very, very distant, second, third, fourth. In 2019, we conducted another general national public survey about attitudes in science, and we had this question. And you can see again, the prevalent response was hope. At the same time, we oversampled STEM professionals. These were primarily medical paraprofessionals, nurses, physician assistants, some physicians. Asked them the same question. And again, hope was the leading response. Interestingly, joy, though, was a little bit higher, and Todd's going to say a lot about that. And then most recently, back in September, another organization, Research America, conducted a larger poll, and they inserted this question. And again, they found that the prevalent answer was hope. Now, just be careful. I'm not suggesting there's a downward trend here. These are sort of different samples, different times within different survey instruments. But the take-home message is clearly hope is the term that resonates the most with Americans when it comes to how they feel about science. And that's really important for us to understand. Okay. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Todd to take us to the next phase of this. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And bear with me for 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you all can see this. But one of the things that we've done to continue on this line of understanding the different connections that not only the public has with science, but also with the scientific community is myself and Chris and colleagues from the Aau Center, as well as Michigan State and the University of Texas at Austin, have done a number of surveys with scientists. And so these data that we're presenting here are from 3 different surveys, 2 of which are samples from randomized samples of scientists from the Association of American Universities, which are the 62 leading research universities in the U.S., public and private in the U.S. and Canada, as well as a survey that we did of scientific societies, including, which I believe 32 were included in that sample. And we asked the same question to these scientists about, which of these following words come to mind when they hear the words when they hear the word science. And
hey, Todd, sorry to jump in. Your screen isn't sharing, unfortunately.
Okay, let's try this again.
Thank you. Sorry. There we go. Now it's there.
Are you seeing the second screen? Hold on.
Yes. now the slides are there and it's showing.
Okay, the slides are there and they're showing. Okay, good. Sorry about that. And you all can hear me. Okay. So was I muted too? Or was it just the slides that weren't showing?
Just the slides. You're okay.
Okay. All right. So presenting data on these different scientific societies and scientists. So we found that results look quite different. So, right, small numbers responded other. Discovery and wonder came up a little bit across the different scientists. Evidence, knowledge, and truth. Curiosity and interest, right? Seen a little bit more of a jump between the survey in 2018 and 2021. Boredom and indifference. It's always interesting during these surveys when scientists answer what comes to mind when they think about science, and boredom ends up coming up. Joey's is an interesting question. Fear and caution, right, didn't come up across any of these different scientists' surveys. But, right, hope and joy and excitement are what came up the most often. And what's interesting is that joy and excitement, compared to the data that Chris shared previously, right, looks quite different among scientists than it does among the public, right? With the public, 45% in the most recent survey that Chris shared indicated hope, only 19% indicated joy and excitement. Yet we see in the AAU survey in 2018, the Society survey in 2018, right, joy and excitement were both significantly higher. And interestingly, right, joy and excitement dropped from 43% in the first wave of this AAU survey to 33% in 2021, indicating, maybe scientists are self-selecting into some different categories, but also maybe there's something more broad about, the science in the current times and their thoughts and feelings about that. But there is this disconnect, right, between how scientists as a group are thinking about science and the emotions that come to their mind versus how the public thinks about this. And so to unpack this, we've thought about, so what are these different orientations, right? Chris talked briefly about this hope orientation, this idea of an emotional reward in the future, a payoff-minded orientation, right? And as Chris said, this orientation very much aligns with this idea of science being a utility, right? Science takes on meaning to the public when it is connected to things that they care about. Case in point within the context of the public. These data are also from a survey that Chris's organization did a few years ago, and the differences in the shapes are not as important as the differences in how different ideological groups respond to this. And we see for the environment, liberals are much more likely to see this as a priority for scientific research compared to conservatives, right? A significant difference between the two. For national defense, right? A science application that aligns much more with conservative ideology. We see that conservatives, right, are much more likely to indicate this as a higher prioritization than liberals are. Yet, when it comes to health and medicine, something, right, that universally is less political in terms of the application, yet has implications. And I think, Chris can allude to this too. When science is brought up, many of the connotations that the public has when they think about science are within these contexts of medicine and of health, right? We see no differences across the board. So when science is connected to these different types of applications, we see very different. We see differences in how the public responds. Yet with scientists, right, this joy and excitement, we characterize as this emotional reward in the present, right? It's process-minded. Scientists enjoy, right, for the most part, the work that they're doing. They enjoy being at the lab. They enjoy, right, the process of discovery. They enjoy many of these, right, characteristics of science that are why so many of us go into the field in and of itself, right? It is about this joy and excitement that they get from this. But the question is, much as how we think about the public looking very different, and right, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the number of research studies that have looked at how, you can segment audiences based on their values, their beliefs, their information diets, try to understand the best ways to connect with them. And with the data Chris presented, right? I mean, hope, regardless of political ideology, regardless of controlling for a lot of other demographics, is quite consistent. Do we see that scientists are monolithic in how they think about, right, this brand of science, their intuitive thoughts and reactions to this word? And so we broke this down looking at how different scientific disciplines, right, respond to this same question. And so the graph on the left is from the 2018 surveys, which was the AAU survey and the Scientific Society survey. And then the graph on the right is from the most recent AAU survey that we just collected only a month or so back. And we can begin to see some differences. So on the x-axis, right, is measures of hope. So where did, right, these different disciplines or individuals, in this case with the public, align with hope? And then on the y-axis is joy and excitement. And then we created this breakoff line, being, right, if joy and excitement is higher, or process-minded is higher. And if you begin to look at these differences just in the in each of these surveys, you'll see some kind of interesting patterns, right? We see physicists, we see mathematicians, we see biology in some cases appearing more towards the higher end of the joy and excitement end. Yet we see engineers, social scientists appearing much more on the process-minded scale. In the more recent 2001 survey, or 2021 survey, right, these results were replicated. We see, again, physicists, mathematicians, geologists in this case, geologists here, both appeared more on the process mind. Again, we see social scientists, those in the humanities, appearing much more on the hope-sided, payoff or hope-minded side of the graph. So this begins to unpack that, right? These disciplines, right, think about these topics or think about the brand, the connotations that come to mind of science very differently. So one of the questions then was, well, what are the differences in these disciplines, right? How can we begin to unpack? And one of the items that comes to mind is, well, are they more focused? Some of these disciplines are much more focused on basic research questions, much more on applied research questions. And this question, which was asked in the most recent AAU survey, is very much inspired by a shout out to, what the Kavli organization and DOE is doing with their new program around engagement with basic science research. But we see that we asked respondents in this survey, do you consider your research addressing more likely to, or addressing in the last 5 years, addressing more basic science research questions or applied research questions? And we categorized or segmented those individuals who answered a great deal is focused on applied research questions versus a great deal applied on basic research questions into this same graph. And sure enough, right, those who are focused on more applied research questions are much more likely to fall on the hope side of the graph, right? Very much seeing this applied context. Whereas, right, the basic more towards the process-minded. So when we think or look then about, okay, so if this is how scientists are falling into these different categories of how they view or how they think about, right, this image of science, how does this translate to some of the objectives that they might have for public communication or public engagement and communication on scientific issues? And so these data also come from the most recent survey that we did of scientists. And it's quite interesting seeing what differences emerge. So, right, respondents, the scientists were asked to rate on a scale of 0 to 100, which do you think is the most important or unimportant objective? And interesting, the two at the top, helping to inform people about scientific issues and getting people interested in science, first of all, very much aligned with this joy and excitement approach that scientists have, right? This getting people interested in science. And B, these data also, parallel data that from previous surveys were helping to inform people about scientific issues always comes up as the most important objective that scientists indicate. Again, alluding to this, continued deficit model of thinking that exists so much in the scientific community, although, that is changing by a lot of the efforts done by, I'm sure, many of you on this call. However, when it comes to relational goals, right, hearing what others think about scientific issues, showing that the scientific community cares about society's well-being, those objectives are ranked much less highly, right? And this says a lot about, how scientists, right, are seeing ways in which they should be connecting to society versus how society, right, should be thinking or engaging with science. And so to illustrate this, I think it's important to come back to this graph about what the differences are that we saw between scientists and the public. And right, these data points coming from the first AAU survey, the second AAU survey, and the society survey, right, show overall how scientists responded to this payoff versus process-minded orientation. And you can see, right, that the scientists cluster very much in one part of this graph, and the public clusters in a very different part. And so the question then is, and I think this is one of the guiding questions for thinking about branding and thinking about what importance branding serves and how it should be used, is it that the public should see, right, the joy and excitement that scientists see, and that scientists, right, that their goal in communicating should be, right, engaging in these goals of, right, trying to elicit excitement, trying to elicit more interest in science, right? I would argue, and I think many others would too, that it's the opposite, right? Scientists need to go where the public is, how the public is viewing this issue. And it's not like the scientists, right, don't see a lot of the value in hope as an emotional connection. But, going back to Chris's original points about, marketing kind of being this intangible asset and what role marketing and branding serve when thinking about it in the context of science, it's important to understand, how you as a scientist, how you as a scientific institution are perceived, how the public perceives you, and then much as any company or organization does in managing the image of their brand, what are the different ways that we as a collective entity of science communication, researchers, practitioners, etc., think about ways that we can move scientists and that we can engage with scientists to helping them understand these mental frameworks that the public has when they think about science. And so that's what I have on the overview of some of the scientists. My apologies for the little technical hiccup, but I guess par for the course these days. So yeah, I think we're happy to answer or address any of the questions that came up in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Todd and Chris, for sharing those insights with all of us. If you're just tuning in, Chris and Todd gave a fantastic overview about the brand of science and how the public and scientists both think about science in general. And please feel free to throw any questions you have using the Q&A box. But I have one to kick us off and get us started, in that, how would we interpret the brand of science given the context of our global pandemic that we are in right now?
Well, I'll start, I guess. Again, the punchline here is that for most Americans, or the prevalent view among Americans is that science is hope. Hope is the expectation of a future outcome. That's the payoff-minded mindset that Todd just talked about. And so with respect to COVID, I think there's a pretty clear payoff that we're all hoping for. We want to return to normalcy, however you define normalcy. And so it's obviously a very germane opportunity for science to kind of come through and be the hero, but it depends. One of the takeaways of the Science is Hope is that people love to tune into science and scientists and hear good news about the future. And when they hear good news about the future, it makes sense. But when scientists deliver not great news about the future, that causes pause. And if you look at let's call them the divisive scientific issues, traditionally, climate change, maybe evolution, GMOs, and now to some degree, let's call it COVID mitigation measures, wearing masks and things like that. You see breakdowns. You see parts of society pulling away and saying, that just doesn't make sense because scientists are not giving me good news. They're basically delivering bad news. And so that's, to your point, what we're seeing with COVID is a really interesting science communication ad hoc experiment, a really important one, but it hasn't unfolded in a surprising way. It's sort of been following the same script as other issues. It depends on how does science lay on my personal beliefs and values, and where it's congruent, I embrace it. And where it's not congruent, I at least pause, and sometimes I even reject it. And I'm waiting for scientists at the end of the day to end the book by saying, well, all's well that ends well. Here's the good news. And, and that's happening. The good news is that we have vaccines and we have other things. But with climate, it's trickier. For 25 years, a lot of Americans have hearing science say nothing but bad news. And they're waiting for the good news, And so anyway, I've said enough about that. Todd?
Yeah, I think adding to that, it's the classic, the threat and fear appeals without efficacy is detrimental. And I think, the more and more that is embedded within communications, it goes a long way. I think one of the things, that I found really interesting about, all of this research that we've been looking at in terms of hope and thinking about hope is, one of the Pew surveys that came out right when the pandemic kind of really hit. I think it was in mid to late March. They did this. They did this Pew survey asking, the American public how they feel about COVID, and there was responses such as having physical reactions, all different types. But the number one answer that came up is that Americans felt hopeful for the future. It was embedded within that. They thought there was going to be a better tomorrow. Unfortunately, it's been really hard to find follow-up survey data on that from Pew, because I think it would be really interesting to see how that's changed over time. But yeah, I agree with a lot of, what Chris said. And I think, it's important, with so much of our news and information about science is mediated, that message continues to resonate in terms of, thinking about hope and thinking about, what that and I think one of the things too is unpacking what that hope context is for different segments of the population. And very much it's kind of this broad question can be a litmus test for what kind of society or what kind of vision, you see in the future. And I think, that's some of the avenues and, ways of thinking that I think we both are interested in pursuing is, unpacking this dimension of hope across a broad section of the public in a more detailed manner.
Definitely. And as we talk today, is Could we clarify the difference between hope and optimism, or is there a difference?
That's a good question. They overlap greatly, but they're not exactly the same. I would say, in terms of the way people are using the word hope that we're seeing, optimism is sort of a general positive attitude. I think the hope is getting down more to the utility of science. So it tends to be connected to certain very specific outcomes. And Todd showed you this with that chart with the triangles and the circles and the liberals. One of the universal things is we all hope for a world where there's no more disease, right? No more affliction. And so regardless of your background, there's universal hope for that outcome. And so I would say hope is probably optimism that is grounded a little bit more in specific outcomes.
Thank you. And then Todd, could you tell us more and elaborate on the distinctions between wonder and discovery versus curiosity and interest in characterizing people's associations with science?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. And I mean, a lot of these, unpacking these emotions are complex endeavors. But I think curiosity, right, runs much more in tune with so much of what, the scientific process is about. It's about, right, this notion of, finding a research area, figuring out how to address it, trying to find answers to the unknown. And, when it comes to wonder, I find that much more in line with this notion of the excitement of science. So not saying the two are obviously mutually exclusive, but right, if you're watching, a documentary on, the wonder of, and maybe, right, there's connections between these two. Maybe wonder leads to more curiosity, or vice versa. And so, right, I think, one of the things that's difficult, and this is, I think all science has limitations, all survey has limitations, is, you can unpack a lot, in terms of these words and how respondents, respond to them. And, I think one of the things that this research could really benefit from is, having more qualitative data. And that's something, we've been thinking about, where, if someone responds with wonder or hope or curiosity or discovery, what do they mean? Like because it can mean very different things to many different people. And so, I think the best answer I have for that is, there needs to be more research in unpacking these meanings across. But I think that a lot of these emotions, and I think a lot of the connections that, these data have shown is, these emotions are connected in many different ways. And, science has, I've been doing some qualitative work, just looking at, some of these connections that the public has when they think about, benefits of science or how they experience science. And it's very different. It's not universal across, depending on the context you engage in, depending on whether it's informal learning, whether it's, watching documentaries, whether it's, what you did in informal school programs. And I think part of it is really understanding that connection some more. I don't know, Chris, if you have additional thoughts on that. I would
just reiterate what you said. To me, the way I interpret interest and curiosity, that's really focusing on the intellect. It's sort of the intellectual aspect. Wonder and discovery are in training an emotional aspect to it as well. So those, to me, I agree with Todd. We have to dig deeper, but I think we'll find that they're actually tapping into very different places. And scientists, as we know, as trained scientists, again, have this at least natural scientists, I'm a chemist physicist, we're on the end of the spectrum there, have this uneasy relationship with emotions in science. To some degree, of the badge of a good scientist is not to be non-passionate, non-emotional, at least in the work, which is true in the nuts and bolts, but we are human beings. We have to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. So that's interesting. Let me just also say that this hope, joy, in the spirit of true exploratory science, this was not something we were looking for. Todd and I and our research team stumbled on this by accident. So this is really interesting and very new, and we have a lot more questions than we have answers. So it would be interesting to see where it goes.
Definitely, and very much looking forward to that as well. Could you each touch on a little bit more about the samples that were surveyed with these questions?
I'll just do my part quickly because, so with regards to the data I showed in the beginning, Science Counts has conducted 3 national online surveys. The sample size ranges from 1,500 to 2,000 participants. They are nationally representative. They are, there's a lot of statistical expertise that goes into ensuring that they are representative in terms of based on census data and things like that. And so the data I showed is based on those surveys.
So for the scientist surveys, so to start, the Scientific Society survey was a survey that went out to 32 different scientific societies. We don't have an exact understanding of how many. I mean, I guess we have some indication of how many members are in each group, which is probably in the tens of thousands. But I think we had about 5,000, a little over 5,000 responses to that. And then for the AAU survey, which was a little bit more, the sampling is a little bit more rigorous, is we have a database of about 15,000 scientists across the AAU universities, so the 62 leading public and private research institutions. And then from that, from those different 62 universities, we created a we created a list of all the different STEM fields, so from all the different disciplines. And then we randomly selected, I think it was something around 7 or 8 different disciplines to pull all of the, faculty, research staff from all of those different departments, and then created a list. And in the first AAU survey wave, we sent it out to about half the list, which was about 7,500 scientists, and have 400 to 500 responses. And then this most recent wave, we sent it out to about 13,000, which includes kind of emails that bounce back, and had about closer to 600 responses. And yeah.
Thank you for that. The next question I have asks, are there any plans to explore the cultural differences in the perceptions of the brand of science? / are you aware of any other publications or papers that might do this already?
I'll let Todd speak to the sort of the academic research side. For us, our motivation in doing this research was as a precursor to actually going out and boosting public support for science. So this was sort of preliminary research before we actually moved to action, which is the pivot point we're on right now. And we feel like we've learned enough where we can begin to act. But segmentation, we've given the broad stroke numbers for the most part, but looking to see how these questions vary based on generally political ideology is the key driver, then education, and then race, gender, age. That's a critical part of what we look at. In fact, that's where the real rich part of the story comes from, because you can begin to get closer to why people feel the way they do, as opposed to just what they feel. So there's a lot more data than what we were able to show here. This is very much the tip of the iceberg. The feeling of hope, the association with hope, is pretty universal, which is good news, although it does vary a little bit but with some of those metrics, but it's always the number one response among the general public. And our work focuses exclusively on Americans. So when the question with regards to cultural, I can interpret that culturally domestically versus internationally. Culture plays a big role, of course, because it has to do with your worldview and how science fits into that worldview. So, you can see, I'll just say this, it's a very, very rich story. I can't speak internationally because we haven't collected data on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are marked differences around the world. And it would primarily be due to culture. And then within the United States, the broad strokes, there's similarities, but when you get down to specific issues, and again, Todd showed us this with national defense versus the environment, on an issue by issue basis, you can have very different, sort of pro-con feelings about the role of science. It has to do with that issue and how that issue intersects what you think is important, which is driven by culture.
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, looking at the branding question specifically, there's nothing that, I'm aware of that, because I think we're the only two people who have thought of using this question in any types of surveys. But I mean, I know, the World Value Survey has done, has a number, not necessarily tapping into this, but tapping into different types of science attitudes and beliefs and kind of general optimism and pessimism. And I think there was a report recently put out from the American Academy of Sports and Sciences that I think Matt Nisbet was an author of, that looked at that. But in terms of breaking this down in other contexts, but I imagine, right, it could, thinking about the whole individualism versus collectivism and how that plays a part in so many different cultures, it would be interesting to see how that plays out. And, even if in some kind of just kind of pilot data I have, I mean, I think generally, these seem to kind of play out consistently, regardless of at least, looking at different ethnicity or different types of other socio-demographic factors. I know Chris's work finds that as well, but these trends still hold regardless.
Awesome. And then, Todd, you made a point in your presentation about the movement of either the public to come up towards the scientists or the scientists to come down towards the public in terms of hope and joint excitement in that graph. And my favorite viewer of the webinars, the anonymous attendee, asks, is it reasonable to expect scientists to move in the direction of hope? From their experience, many scientists find joy and excitement in their work, but lack hope because their research might indicate a negative future, funding, lack of funding, et cetera, et cetera. The example that they provided was climate change. And so is it reasonable to expect just the scientists to move towards the hope, or should we also push the public up as well in terms of joy and excitement too?
Well, I mean, it's always easy to say when there's, a dichotomy somewhere in the middle kind of always is helpful. But, I think from the standpoint, and I've heard this before with people who study climate change or people who study other issues where, right, the forecasts look grim. I think in general, I mean, it's like when you're trying to motivate action, when you're trying to motivate change, right? And I think, right, the environmental movement has done this consistently with using fear appeals. And, I think there's been a lot of research saying fear appeals, can garner attention. They have some backfire effects if they're not paired with any kind of efficacy strategies. They don't go very far. But and there's been research on this too. I mean, there was a study looking at hope appeals within climate change, and right, they do have influence on how the public thinks about this. And I guess it's to say that the public, that there shouldn't be any activities involved to garner interest and excitement of science, because we know that's how so many young people get involved in science. We know that's that could lead to different outcomes. But I think thinking about this hope mindset is it doesn't necessarily have to be hope in the sense of everything is going to be perfect, but it's hope in the sense of well, what can we do to reach that next step? What can we do to reach that next stage? And I think you think about how it's used in politics. You think about, hope is used in so many different contexts, and it's oftentimes something that is more prose than sometimes is actually enacted. But I think the notion of understanding what the public wants as that future outcome, or sees as that future outcome, and being able to address that. I think it's hard, and I imagine too, this has some, in unpacking that context among scientists who might be, and we have a question in a previous survey that we haven't dug into as much about, do you feel that you deal in any type of controversial research, or, research in topics like climate change or others that maybe have, outcomes that are, where the warning signs are there and there is dire outlooks. But, what effect does that have on scientists communicating? I think is really important. And I think that's another, great question to think about in terms of unpacking the brand image, especially of scientists.
Definitely. And unfortunately, we are running close on time. And so I would like to leave the floor open to both of you if there are any final parting thoughts that you have to share with the attendees today. Chris, I'll start with you. What's on your mind? What would you like to share?
Well, let me just wrap up by saying, building off where Todd left off, I hope no one takes, or I use the word hope, I hope no one takes the message they take home with them from this talk is that we as scientists always have to give good news. That is not what we're saying. We are out there to research and acquire evidence, right? What we're talking about is the context of communicating with the public. And so this payoff versus process mindset, clearly the public looks at science from an outcome payoff point of view. So the take-home message for that is scientists need to talk to the public when they're communicating with the public on the public's terms. Doesn't mean they have to change how they do their science or how they think about science, but there's this dialect difference and there's some language transition. And so the language of payoff is why and what. What are you trying to do and why does this matter? That's how payoff people think. Process-minded people think how. Here's how I actually do the research. Let me get into the details, which is where a lot of us, go. So that's just, this is sort of mapped out that we have to do some translation. And just the other part of it is, again, the take-home message isn't that we should always give good news. And so that immediately gets into the how. How do I deliver bad news that's incongruent with what you're saying? And yeah, life is complicated. There's a lot to that question. But I would say somewhere along the line, an oncologist, oncologists do this every day. Oncologists deal with very, very sad, tragic situations. And the really good oncologists somehow manage to bring out hope in the situation, even if the situation's bleak. And they're not lying, they're being honest. And so somewhere I hope an oncologist writes a book, an oncologist's approach to climate change, and could give some good advice to us, practical advice to us. I think there would be a lot of tactical nuggets of gold there on how to do exactly that, how to remain hopeful and optimistic and positive in light of the fact that, pragmatically, we often have to give bad news and deal with difficult situations.
Yeah, so concluding thoughts. I mean, my view has been looking at science through this branding context, through this branding framework. And I think, right, this hope finding, especially among the public, and even having, some appearing predominantly among scientists as well, has really showed that, like, when we think about a brand, right, and the different ways we interact with the brand, right, a product, a service, anything you can think of that, right, you might, and even ideas, right, they have these functional benefits. They provide you some benefit in the future, right? We experience, right? We get feelings. Chris talked about, right, with Harley-Davidson, and they're not selling motorcycles. They're selling this feeling of, going on the open road. And they're symbolic, right? Many brands carry a lot of symbolism, right? Again, going back to the Harley-Davidson and the Apple example. And part of what, really, I think, is important, I think, for the scientific community to think about is, we know the functional aspects are really important for communicating with the public. How that, right, there's a lot of nuances within that, but there is that clear connection with the hope. I think thinking more generally about how the disparate entities, some, more connected than others, think about the symbolism of science, and, right, going back to the little billboard from the Neil deGrasse Tyson, it's like, what is the symbol? What are the symbolic images that the public has for science? What is this? What are these images that come to mind? And I think oftentimes there's a way to connect these different, brand touch points, how we experience it, the symbolic context around it, the functional benefits. And it is difficult, right, to do all three. But science, right, is very different than other types of branding exercises, and that it cuts across a lot of things. It has very different types of connections and meanings. And I think one of the things I think about is what are the different strategies that can be used for consistency across those? Because if there's anything that branding 101 can teach us, it's that consistency matters. The brands that have the strongest market share are the ones who have that consistent image, right? You go to McDonald's in Madison, where I am, or you go in Beijing, it's more or less the same thing. It's more or less the same image. It's more or less the same product. And I think thinking about consistency across these different touch points and how hope can be a lens and these other emotions through that, I think is important for us all to think about. Yeah.
Definitely. Consistency matters. And now you have me craving a Diet Coke from McDonald's. So it's probably where I will head after this. Thank you so much, Todd and Chris, for sharing these insights and for your time today. There were so many great things and a lot of questions to unpack here. So we're hoping that this won't be the last conversation that we have with both of you. A recording of today's session will be available next week. Stay tuned for an email that contains this. And we are excited to continue talking about what this all means for science communication trainers, as well as the science communication community at large, in our third and final Willingness to Engage webinar. So be on the lookout for more information and stay in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter at aldecenter.org. And while you're there, definitely check out our newly created Master of Science program in Science Communication that is offered jointly by the Aau Center and the School of Communications and Journalism at Stony Brook University. Finally, we'd like to again thank the Rita Allen Foundation and the Kavli Foundation for their generous support in making this webinar series possible. Thank you all again for joining us, and please have a great and safe weekend.